So as I said, I'm going to repeat myself, I'm sorry, because I didn't start with that. This is the last of the fellowship initiative that my colleague Natalia and I started this year in the Public History Access. We're joined here by Nayansaku Mufwankolo, who's going to present their work and research. The title of this lecture/poem is Western Double Standards in Media Coverage, Continuing Dehumanization of BIPOC. Nayansaku Mufwankolo is a lecturer in cultural studies and critical theory, as well as the delegate of diversity and inclusion at the Geneva University of Art and Design, called HED Genève. They are also a consultant in diversity and inclusion, and they give workshops on intersectional violence and discriminations. As an artist, their research is twofold and focuses through poetry on Afrocosmic autofiction by the means astrophysics and quantum physics, and on the historical discursive processes of fictionalizing power structures. As you might have noticed, all these words are very big words, and I'm having troubles navigating these. But I assure you, this is going to be informative. You're going to learn more about it as we talk about it than as me reading about all of these very, very difficult words. I'll leave the floor to you, Nayansaku. We're very happy to have you here, and I hope we can have like an informative session and a discussion after. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, big words. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to discover Belval and Luxembourg, even if it's been like a few days that I've been here. But thank you so much for having me, and it's also a pleasure to meet all of you. And I'm very delighted to do this presentation. So basically it's going to be mostly poetry reading, because as well you said, my means of developing my research is through poetry, for many different reasons that we will have time afterwards to speak about all of these big words and concepts and everything. So, but without further ado, just a couple of words, because I know that it's not the usual academic sort of setting in which, well, we usually do research. Disclaimer, it's going to be rhythmic somehow. So as I say, it's poetry also because it opens a lot in terms of the semantic field. And so it means that, well, you will all dwell into it with me, and voila. So, a little bit of light. It is necessary to visualize the roots of white supremacy as a power structure, the justification of European colonialism that has been organizing the world through one specific lens and perspective, via the construction, the fictionalization, establishment, hierarchization, and protection of whiteness as a mutual exclusive system, which privilege and position Western whiteness and the West as the enforced norm, a construct based on an ensemble of technologies, pillars of well-engineered processes, which have aimed and still are aiming towards maintaining whiteness as the hegemon. Hegemon through ideology, hegemon through the doctrine of discovery, hegemon through European imperial dominance, hegemon through modern colonialism, hegemon through neo-imperialism, hegemon through neo-colonialism, hegemon through settler colonialism, hegemon through the transatlantic enslaved trade, hegemon through global systems of economic domination and exploitation, hegemon through the imposition of an unequal political and economical global system of resource extraction and labor exploitation, hegemon through racial capitalism, hegemon through resource exploitation, hegemon through repeated colonial patterns, hegemon through constructed artificial territorial borders, hegemon through the social contract, hegemon through occupation, through military blockade, hegemon through fortress Europe, hegemon through massive global population shifts, hegemon through, quote, making sure the profit always flowed back to the mother country, end quotes, hegemon through systemic inequality, hegemon through systemic racism, hegemon through apartheid, hegemon through ecocide, hegemon through famine, hegemon through institutions, genocides, global governance bodies, hegemon through climate change, hegemon through laws, social structures, subordination, hegemon through Orientalism, Eurocentrism, gender norms and sexuality, hegemon through epistemicide, hegemon through essentialist ideas of European exceptionalism, hegemon through pinkwashing, hegemon through status quo, hegemon through greenwashing, hegemon through narrative that naturalize domination, hegemon through imposed linguistic structure of dominance, hegemon through memory politics, hegemon through missionaria, church, or imperialist narratives, hegemon through international institutions, hegemon through surveillance, security, and policing, hegemon through climate and environmental policies, hegemon through biotechnology, negrophobia, Arabophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, hegemon through transnational corporations, propaganda, education, hegemon through knowledge economy, literature, arts, science, technology, hegemon through development and aid discourses, hegemon through cultural commodification, hegemon through GAFAM, AI, hegemon through media, hegemon through alienation, hegemon through invisibilization, hegemon through normalization, hegemon through silence, hegemon through effective colonialism, hegemon through the systemic identification of Black, Indigenous, and children of color, hegemon through the normalization of the suffering of non-white bodies, hegemon through double standards, through dehumanization, through, quote, the freedom for settlers built on the back of Black and Indigenous people, end quote. Hegemon through paternalism, hegemon through stereotypes, hegemon through denial, hegemon through rape, hegemon through theft, bulgery, and robbery, hegemon through guilt, hegemon through weaponized tears, hegemon through Western media double standards, Western media double standard through language, Look closely, where the West anoints itself as a neutral observer, while ensuring that certain lives remain storyless, stripped away from any ounce of humanity, just to be reduced to a numerical monolithic mass, interchangeable, devoid of individuality, interchangeable, devoid of personhood. Wait. interchangeability of post-colonial commodity, the interchangeability of post-colonized body, perpetuating racial hierarchies, working like linguistic cogs of white supremacist architecture, which lies in the smallest phrasing, inherited, shape-shifting, locked narrative through time and space, naturalized, that not so long ago once drew border on continent with a ruler, reproduced. Their headlines sprinkle colonial residues between those who, quote, look like us, end quote, those, quote, civilized, end quote, and the others. A subtle distortion bent on constricting compassion towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color, hollowed out by carefully chosen words, a polished, crafted curation, expats versus immigrants, misunderstood versus violent, detained versus arrested, protective versus threatening, innocent until proven guilty versus guilty, free-spirited versus out of control, local man versus Latino man, walkers versus delinquents, distressed woman versus dangerous Black woman, passionate versus angry, protests versus riots, mentally disturbed versus terrorist, shooter versus terrorist, lone wolf versus terrorist, had a bad day versus criminal, patriot versus extremist, having a meltdown versus acting crazy, 16-year-old boy versus 12-year-old Black man, a child versus a 7-year-old Black woman, coming from difficult upbringing versus criminal, freedom fighting versus terrorism, ambitious versus aggressive, boys will be boys versus young thugs, man with a tragic past versus member of a violent gang, unorthodox methods versus barbaric practices, explorer versus invaders, making ends meet versus gaming the system, resourceful entrepreneur versus illegal street vendor, distraught father versus irresponsible immigrant parents, at-risk youth versus juvenile delinquent, alternative lifestyle versus potential unassimilated outsider, conservative traditionalist versus religious fundamentalist. Gnawing little by little on the neural pathway of empathy, slowly but surely since centuries, and once more, their headlines spew colonial residues, a scaffold of cultural hegemony, carefully minimizing the implicit violence, as the violence of not naming is another form of brutality, as the violence it seeks to deny. Control versus occupation, ground operation versus invasion, security operation versus aggression, targeted strike versus indiscriminated bombings, collateral damage versus massacre, enhanced interrogation technique versus torture, security fence versus separation wall, settlements versus colonies, allies on the ground versus proxy militias, stabilizing influence versus authoritarian control, dense housing versus refugee camps, genocides versus silent genocide, liberation mission versus invasion campaign, peacekeeping forces versus foreign occupation army, buffer zone versus occupied territory, restoring democracy versus overthrowing of sovereign government, surgical strikes versus indiscriminate aerial bombings, defense measure versus provocation, precautionary deployment versus illegal presence, civilian casualty versus mass slaughters, peace deal versus imposed settlement, humanitarian corridor versus forced displacement routes, enforcing all hierarchies through euphemisms, what an unbiased impartiality, grainy transmission settled by century of domination. As once said James Baldwin, the root function of language is to control the universe by describing it. Happy 100th anniversary to you. Each pose a crevasse where the Western media tone falters. Do you condemn the rationalization of the irrational? No slip of tongue to be found here.
Thank you.
We can let that sing. We can take a 5-minute break.
Thank you. There's a lot of thoughts, a lot of emotions, a lot of things flowing in. I'm gonna give the floor to Joella. If you have questions, let us know. Otherwise, those of you with us here, if you have questions for Nayansaku. Sure, Thomas.
Thank you, and thank you for creating emotions. Because we often think of universities as emotionless, and that's been one of our weaknesses. So thank you for bringing that back or creating it. You use poetry, which is in itself disrupting what we usually do here. So another thank you. Do you think it has to be done through poetry arts? Or can you reach the same objective reusing the mainstream media? Or the media is by itself reproducing the colonial bias?
To me, thank you for the question. To me, really, poetry is a mean that allows more plasticity, because obviously through traditional academic writing, there is this sense in which via discourse, there's also a certain way to speak, academically speaking. I do remember, for instance, I'm going to take when I started university, I do remember that it was a whole language I had to learn, because academic language is a language in itself. And it's a very crafted and constructed language that sometimes does not leave room for something else to happen. And to me, this is something that is highly constructive, because I saw the difference regarding my grades. When I started, really first year bachelor, grades were not that okay. And the more and more I sort of, ate and digest this specific language, the vocabulary that was needed, all of these big words, and so on and so forth, the more my grades were going up and up and up through excellence. And so to me, at some points, I realized that I've always written poetry since I'm very young, like 11 years old. And so I needed to find a way to decolonize also academic language. Because I know that obviously if I want to be heard, read, and have some sort of legitimacy, well, you have to play by the sort of rules with the tools that are, well, the tool with which academia and academic writing in general has been built. And so to me, I wanted to find another way that could allow, as you said, maybe create also a form of emotions. Because what interests me, we know that languages is also embedded in intertextuality, metatextuality, and so on and so forth. But through poetry, to me, there are other layers that comes and that digs into people's own subjectivity. Because at some points, it is some sort of web of words that are interconnected, that can follow a structure that can be very diverse. But I need to toy with this. Because I feel that anytime I write a paper that is academic, first I'm bored. I'm completely bored. Because I just feel that I'm doing something that is not natural, somehow natural to me, and that I cannot go in the depth in which I can go via poetry. And so also, well, you mentioned usually what I do now also with my poems is that they are highly visual. For instance, I play with the different meanings that you can have behind words, depending if you change one letter in this word. It open up another field of meaning that can be attached to it. For instance, when writing, for instance, the word hegemon, each E is replaced with, like, for instance, the pound symbol or the euro symbol. And so it says something more that you cannot see, you cannot know if you don't see it. But also what interests me is I work a lot through installation work, because I love playing with fragmentation and repetition and bending space and time, and the way you're going to read a poem, because you can read it in so many different ways and always find, like, opening up new meanings. And this is not something that I can do with like an academic paper, you know, but it may be on some, I don't know, on object, then I spread through, like, the space. It wouldn't be the same, but this is something that I can do with poetry. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah,
Let me know.
It raises other questions, but yes.
Okay.
It's good.
It's a personal question, so please feel free to not answer it.
Yeah.
But maybe it's because I'm German, we don't know how to handle our emotions, or it's because I'm really angry today for reasons I'm not allowed to spill here. That has nothing to do with these beautiful people. But how do you manage going with your emotions? Because this text is extremely emotional, and thank you for sharing that. But how do you handle these emotions?
I don't know. I just handle them. I mean, that's also a way to... Writing poetry is also a mean into which, well, you can throw things, you can put things. But otherwise, I go to the gym. This is also... do a lot of sports. Sometimes, you know, you need to, depending on, like, doing emotional work as well. It's necessary. It's necessary. Also to find some sort of balance.
Follow-up question. Academia, do you enter playing the rules and then you disrupt, or do you embrace disruption and see what's happening? Because a very specific way of academia is promotion and what counts as valid. So how do you balance what they expect from you and getting in a position that you can do whatever you want? Or, no, I'm writing poetry, they're academic papers, and let's see what happens.
It's easy. I'm in an art school, University of Art and Design. I'm not like in the English department or humanities or whatever. That's also why I have the possibility to do what I do. Obviously, I couldn't do what I'm doing if I was, let's say, in the history of arts department or in whatever like classic academic. I am in an art school. So it's okay to do what I do.
So is that limited to arts? Like, can this be transferred to other disciplines, or is it?
I think it should be, but then it's not me who has the rules, so that's the difference also. I think it could be something that should be necessary, or at least possible, but then there are also the academic necessities, and I'm not the one who are making the rules. Obviously, if I was the one having, like, for instance, a share in whatever, maybe it's something that I would say, okay, let's go there to also see how we can maybe transform also academia in a sense, and maybe open up perspective. But hey.
And we don't have any art department at the University of Luxembourg, so that's
yeah. Joella, you had your hand raised. Do you want to ask the question?
Yes, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
You can hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you so much for the speech. I would say it was very interesting to hear, and I love your comment, what you were saying about the code switching, that you had to learn how to, switch the language, and also in that way your decolonial practice of not using the academic language. And I was wondering in what kind of spaces or places you have been sharing your work, and what kind of reception you have received, and whether you also reach different publics through that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So it's mostly diverse, obviously a lot in the art world or art field, let's say, but also in places such as this one when I'm invited. And it's all a matter of accessibility. To have access in such places, then you have to be invited by people who are interested, also maybe with different type of research-based practice. Mine is through arts, but mostly in art space or art milieu. And little by little, slowly but surely, if I can say, I hope to extend also this.
I'm gonna start with my questions. I'm ready.
Yes.
But just maybe to continue on the conversation of academic acceptance, academic judging, academic language versus how we want to speak. I think this tension is very, very much something that we could relate to in public history, in terms of what counts as an output of your research and what doesn't. So when we go do an exhibition, when we go do a concert, when we work with the different community voices and groups to put forward their part or their share of the history, when we think of how to be closer to people when we're presenting our research. So we decide to go in the streets and do installations, or we decide to do a public event where we have a music concert. This is where we start fighting with the academic world on what counts as an outcome versus a research paper. And I think that, like, I'm very happy that you've presented today in this format, because poetry is one of the tools that public history practices can also learn a lot from, how to bring this narrative closer to people, closer to their emotions, closer to their hearts, which also makes you reassess whether or not research always has to be neutral, whether or not research has to always be objective. Can it touch people's lives and vécu, what they lived and what they went through? So on that, I'm so glad that we're starting this. It's a constant fight. I cannot tell you the amount of times that I've sent papers that mix between my personal story and my research, and I've been rejected from publications where the journals came back and said, we don't do this kind of free writing. So you can either decide to keep doing it until you get to power and then you do a journal yourself, or you can sometimes get your way through and then it happens. So the more there is of us, the better it is. And there's also that something, like we talk about language. Language is, as we noticed and as we learned in your poem, language is very violent.
Oh yeah, it is.
Language is very elite. Language is, it can literally like turn off the lights on you forever, or give you a platform. There's a poet, Palestinian poet called Rafif Ziedi. She uses poetry to speak on the Palestinian cause, on her life and on the lives of others. And in one of her poems that is titled Allow Me to Speak My Mother Tongue, she continues the whole poem speaking in English. And I know why she does this, but I wanted to know, why do you use English in your work?
Well, I'm very well aware that I'm using a colonial language, but French is my mother tongue, and language is the other language I learned since so far. But I'm mostly writing in English because it allows me more playfulness. French is so rigid. I mean, with English, at some points, if you take someone's name and you transform it as a verb, you will understand all the meaning that is behind it. You know, if you say, yeah, yesterday I was cheering all night, you get a meaning. In French, it's not possible. Or at least for me, it's not something that is possible. There's no this playfulness with French. So I decided to write in English, also because, well, language, as you said, is one of the most powerful, it's the most powerful tool that exists on Earth. You can do everything with language, and it allows you to do everything. So basically, English has this playfulness. Maybe at some point I will mix also with other languages, because this is what I do. I love the playfulness of the linguistic plasticity. I'm a bit of a nerd with it. I love linguistics. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And so, yeah, English. And it's funny because my mom doesn't speak English, and to me it's important that she can have access to what I write, because as she said, she's my #1 fan. And so she's asking me to sometimes translate my poems, and I'm trying to translate, and I know that there's not the depth that I find like in English, but I also know that with her knowledge of me, she also has access to other depth that sometimes through words I'm not able to reach in French. But yeah, English because, well, hey, colonialism.
This is how every argument between me and Natalia ends. Hey, colonialism.
I was born in Switzerland, so born and raised in Switzerland, so I learned French, and then French wasn't that, it wasn't given. So English is really more playful.
Maybe also on how you build your work. There's a lot of research in your poem. Like there's a lot of going back and forth in between sources, looking for the different narratives, and we're talking about the media discourse. So I'm sure it took you a lot of time to build this in this way. How do you go about in your research? Is it academic research that feeds into poetry, or is it also art research that brings you to this point?
It's everything. It's everything. Because to me, it's really important. Yeah, obviously there are some like academic research, because this is also my background. But there's also a lot of artistic research. There's a lot of, it's going in all directions. And to me, that's also what is important. It's not to have some sort of hierarchy between the type of research that I'm going to do and the sources that I'm going also to use. And to me, this is something that is really important, is to really try also to break away or to de-hierarchize these hierarchies.
Thank you.
One question, just going a little bit back on the university environment. I would like to, something that I really appreciated in your poem is you mentioned it like the epistemicide, and also we are always talking about it, how decolonizing starts with epistemology, how important is that. And I was curious actually about your teaching approaches. Like how do you, and even the projects that you work at the university or outside, how do you like bring this for the discussion, for the practices, and in this environment at the university, not only about like producing a paper, but also like how to teach people that they should invite people to think in another way. That's the point.
Well, in the university where I work and teach, we have a lot of like public seminars and so on and so forth, where there are different scholars / artists / designer that talk about their practice and research and the different means through which they do this. What is funny is that my job, basically, I am some sort of Swiss knife. I do many different things, and I'm working in a very holistic manner. I am basically the person who is in charge of thinking and implementing diverse and inclusive policy for the entire school. So this is already something that is very holistic, because when we think of what is inclusion, what is diversity, what is equity, and so on and so forth, on this scale, well, it's huge. And regarding my my teaching, so I have a seminar that is very, 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 very theoretical. It's really that learning how to read, basically. Learning how to read like theoretical paper or books or whatever, because words are important. The thing is that usually I remember that it took a lot of time when I was at university to properly learn how to read, critically speaking. What does it mean when you close read a sentence and everything that is contained within this sentence? So I have one that is really, really super theoretical. And I have another one in which we also do theory, but in a completely different way, through a completely different approach that is more grounded on like the field, like material aspect rather than theory, and then we link it to theory. And so this is a completely different approach that works also a lot. I don't know if I answered your question, because I used to, you know, wonder.
Do you want? I want to close with a question if you don't have one.
Yeah,
Okay. You have one.
So you can still close with your question afterwards.
Just check if Joella keeps like.
Yeah, I wasn't. Yeah.
Joanna, do you have another question?
No, thank you for asking.
Because you had your hand raised, so I thought you had another question.
No, I'm just stuck in traffic very much.
No
In
worries.
between, I put my hand up, but I haven't been able to turn it down. But thank you for asking.
I have a question, but I'm sorry if that's a difficult question, and I don't know if we could answer that question. But your portrait is about media, language in media, and the effect and the structure that it brings or develops. Could that be applied to the past? I'm thinking in terms now as an historian, thinking about the past and how things change. Is that something that you can reproach and reuse about media in the past or sources in the past, or even, you know, now and then? Is that something that we could do? And I'm thinking out loud if, for example, poetry could be part of a PhD. I know that PhD about history can also be about dancing, in which the researcher reenact or represent the argument and change. Do you think that poetry could be, or your method could be applied to studying sources from the past? Is that something that could be reused, or is it? And I'm sorry if it's a difficult question, because
No. It's. I don't see why it couldn't. I think because the way that, for instance, I do it with, for instance, this specific poem, there is a back and forth, and there is also a twist of temporality, because I started with something that seemed kind of historical, but that is still very much embedded now. And so also the fact that it's sort of an object that is just shape-shifting through time and space. So it's just another way of presenting it, or presenting itself or themselves, I would say. So I think that the same way that I did, for instance, regarding the headlines, it's something that you can do with newspaper, because it's then how you point to what type of vocabulary has been used to depict or speak about. And you can, it's very webby, because it's truly a spider web, and it's not webbing some sort of two-dimensional aspect, but in a multi-dimensional aspect in which, well, something here can vibrate along through another line, and then it just goes in all direction. So no, I'm not. Yeah, I think it could be completely.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a history of like some communities in the US, for example. That's the example I have in mind. Have been depicted in newspapers, and the word that have been used like in 1800s, 1912, and so your opposition between, you know, this expression, that expression in the present, in the media, could also be like the history of those expressions about the same people.
Including the quotes and citations. Like, I found it really relevant that it could have been a paper because it had all the elements that build a paper, but it's not, so haha. One last question on the participatory aspect of your work, maybe. Have you been, or have you tried collective writing with people?
No.
Do you think this is a dimension that you could explore at some point that could bring something, or do you think it's more about what I lived and how I translate it, or what I feel and how I put it in words?
I'm even wondering if it's solely about like how I feel. To me, it's really something to, of course, it can be something that can be doable, because everything can be doable. But then, is it the outcome that would suit me specifically? To me, it would be a completely different project. Because then my research is also, there is somehow something so specific, because this format is one format that is part of something bigger, that is also connected to my Afrocosmic autofiction poetry. So yeah, it could be, I could do, for instance, a workshop in which, like, yeah, we're trying to find ways in which people can do maybe some sort of cadaveric ski of writing and whatsoever. But it would be something kind of different to me, I would say.